Great, hello, welcome to week 12. As you get started on your research project for the end of the semester, I wanted to give you a quick little crash course in getting started with doing theater research. So to start off, the best way to start a research project is to begin with a question. Ideally, something that you are really interested in knowing the answer to. That's going to help keep you motivated throughout your research process. And that's also likely going to help you really dig deep into whatever it is that you're researching. So this might be a question like, you might start from a place of what is a question that you think should be answered about American theater history, a question that should be answered about a specific theater company, about a particular play that you were really drawn to. And then from there, depending on how large or small that question is, if it is a really big question that's going to be difficult to answer in the 8 to 10 pages that you have for your research project, you'll want to think about what are some of the smaller questions that you might answer to get at that bigger question that you have, and which of those are you most interested in pursuing? Or if you have a very, very specific question, what larger question might encompass your more specific and detailed ones? Another thing you're going to want to look for is, has somebody answered this question before? So you might find that a scholar has already written an article on exactly what question you want to be answered, which is exciting because then you get to know the answer. But then there also might be a moment where you think like, okay, what can I add to this conversation? How can I put this person in conversation with other people? So there's a bunch of ways that you can approach that. Again, starting from a place of your own personal interest is always the best way to start and tends to produce the most interesting projects rather than trying to get at what you think the instructor might want to hear. So once you have your big research question that you are going out to answer, you need to go gather some sources of information. And there's 3 types of sources that I'm going to tell you about today. The first is primary sources, secondary sources, and theatrical ephemera. So to start with primary sources, these are basically just a firsthand account of an event or of a performance. So how do you determine if something is a primary source? The most important thing to consider is the perspective of the writer. So are we hearing from someone's personal experience doing a production or seeing it? Did this person witness the performance event as an audience member? Is this an artist giving an account of their own work? Is it a critic who has written a review of the work that they've seen? So the idea is, how close are they to the event? It should be a firsthand account. So some examples of things that are primary sources would be things like interviews, podcasts, performance reviews, news articles, magazine articles, memoirs, artist statements. And often the purpose of primary sources is to share this perspective with a very broad public. Secondary sources, on the other hand, tend to be for a more academically geared audience. These are peer-reviewed academic accounts. And when I say peer-reviewed, basically what that means is other scholars in the field have reviewed this work and have determined that it's factually accurate and up to the general standards of the field and is valuable information that ought to be shared, a valuable analysis perspective. So how to determine if something is a secondary source versus a primary source. Generally, a secondary source is going to be an analysis, sometimes of other people's account of the event. A pretty clear way to tell is it published through an academic press or journal? And has the person personally witnessed the events that they are analyzing? Sometimes a scholar might have witnessed the events that they're talking about, but more often than not, they're looking at someone else's account of the event. Often we're looking at it historically. So the person writing today couldn't have possibly seen that production in 1920. So the key here is kind of how far removed is the person writing from the event itself. The things that you're going to see as secondary sources are academic journal articles and books, not necessarily memoir, but more kind of informational, analysis-driven sorts of books. Finally, theater ephemera. So these are the physical artifacts that are created as part of the performance and production process and that get left behind. It's the kind of physical evidence that the event happened. So we have a very large collection of theatrical ephemera at the Theater Research Institute. So these might be scripts, posters, playbills, production photos, costume pieces, set pieces, design renderings. And a rendering is basically like a drawing, a plan for how a designer is going to build a set or a costume or a prop. So kind of the physical pieces of evidence left behind by the artists afterwards. So I want to show you now a little bit of where you can go to look for each of these types of sources. So I have a link in the lecture page for this week. This is our OSU theater resources through the OSU libraries. And we have a whole bunch of different ways to go about finding things here. So this is the home page of the theater resources page. We have a set of video and audio databases in here where you can watch recordings or listen to recordings of shows. Those would also be in the theater ephemera type of source. We also have our theater databases. So these are specific collections of materials gathered in one spot. Things that I particularly want to draw your attention to that might be useful for this project. You have the Black Drama database. There are a lot of plays in there. There's some articles, a bunch of theater ephemera, some primary sources. So that's going to give you a whole mix of things. Our entertainment industry magazine archive will give you a lot of performance reviews. It's particularly useful for that. Artist interviews, that'll give you a lot of primary sources. I particularly like the North American Theater database. That is a whole mix of primary and secondary sources. So how I will go about beginning my research project here. So now I'm in the North American theater database. So let's say I'm researching Ntozake Shange, and say my research question is I want to know how she has impacted feminist theater artists. So I might just start searching for her and see what can I find in here. All right, so I've got a mix of ephemera and secondary sources, it looks like here. So I've got a few anthologies that I can click on to probably read chapters of books or articles. I've also got, it looks like a playbill from a 1977 production here. Let's see, I've only got about 8 resources here. So that's not giving me a whole lot, but it's a reasonable place for me to start to see what other people are saying. We've also got theater journals and magazines here. So American Theater Magazine is the largest one in the industry. Another one that might be particularly helpful is Theater Journal. That's a US-based one that covers a lot of theater history. New Theater Quarterly is going to have a lot of analysis of newer shows and reviews of them. So you can go search in any of those. Another option is to go to the main library page and search what are people outside of theater saying. So that might actually be helpful with my Ntozake Shange research. Let's see what that turns up. And I'm going to say I want to know about Ntozake Shange and feminism. If you look over here, I've got a whole bunch of articles here, so I'll check that out first. All right, and it looks like I've got quite a bit more to work with than I had with the North American Theater database. And I think part of that is I'm looking beyond just theater in here. I'm seeing a lot of these articles are coming from places like African American Review, Black American Literature Forum. Here we've got Theater Journal. But in this case, it might be helpful to look into a variety of different disciplines because a variety of different people are likely to be writing about her. So next week's, one more thing that I wanted to show you. Those are all of our library resources. I also want to point out there's a site called Google Scholar that you can use to do pretty much any research after you leave the university as well, and it's covers pretty much anything on open access academic articles. So let's see what this turns up here. If I'm looking for a specific name, I want to put it in quotes. That gives me 6,000 results. And I want to know about and feminism. All right. Here I've got kind of a variety of books, of people looking at her work from a feminist perspective, of people working from, got published in the Black Scholar. Eventually it'll get to some theater sources. So something that I really like about Google Scholar is that you can cite it by just clicking on this little button. That'll format your citation for you. I highly suggest doing that as you go, as you're gathering sources. Whether or not you end up using all of them, it's much easier to find that citation from the beginning rather than toward the end. We'll talk next week a little bit more about how to go about making your annotated bibliography. And until then, have a good week.